Well, let's record that. Welcome, everyone. My name is Megha Sanjay, and I'm on the Arts India US team. This is Conversations with an Artist, a series by our organization where we discuss various aspects of the artistic journey with leading Indian classical artists in the United States. For those of you who are new to our community, Arts India US provides emerging Indian classical artists in the US with the tools and network to continue their learning, create new work and showcase these art forms within and outside the Indian diaspora. So today we're talking with Malini Srinivasan, a critically acclaimed Bharatha Natyam artist, educator, and choreographer. She has performed as a soloist across the US, India, and Europe, and collaborated with leading ensembles like Ragamala and Thresh. And her original choreographic works have received multiple grants and residencies, and she has been a visiting professor lecturer at various universities, including Princeton, and an adjunct lecturer at SUNY Stony Brook. Currently, she is the school programs manager and a teaching artist with City Lore. In today's conversation, we're going to explore her approach to storytelling in Bharatanatyam, how narratives evolve in a modern context, and the future of storytelling in the classical arts. I'd like to introduce our executive director, Vani Krishnamurthy, who will be conducting the interview.
Thank you so much, Megha. It's really a pleasure to have Malini with us. Malini and I go back too many years, to many fun times in India, and I've learned so much from her just in sitting next to her and watching a performance sometimes if I'm not watching her herself. So thank you for joining us today, everyone. Malini, I want to get right into it. If you can unmute here. Let me just, there we go. So I just want to start quickly, briefly for us, if you can just spend a couple of minutes tracing some of the core aspects of your overall journey in Bharatanatyam.
Sure. Well, welcome everyone. It's nice to see familiar faces. And thank you for having me. So I would say my journey started not as my journey, but my family's journey. My grandmother, Gomlavali Mani, she was a Bharatanatyam teacher, and um, she was widowed at age 35. And while she was married, she was not really allowed to pursue dance in any way by her husband. But when she was widowed with four small children, she decided to start a dance school called the Geetanjali Dance Academy in Mumbai, in Bombay. And this is a very wonderful environment in her apartment, ground floor, where me and my sister would visit every summer. My cousins would learn. My brother, who's here, also has like very beautiful memories. Pretty much anyone who entered this house and this family has this very tender feeling for Bharatanatyam. We did not end up scarred and oppressed by our experiences of dance. Her approach to dance was very much different from the sort of strict and austere male dominated guru type of spaces, and hers was much more of an inclusive community setting. So I grew up learning dance with her and with my mother in Maryland, who taught at home. But I never thought of Bharatanatyam as necessarily mine. It was something our family did, and I didn't think of myself as particularly good at it. Um, I dabbled a little performing in college, sort of getting back to my roots. But I would say my own journey in Bharatanatyam started quite a bit later. Um, I was uh, pursuing a life of activism in the development world in India. Um, I was 24, I was working for a nonprofit, and that was really the direction my life was taking. When suddenly my mother passed away, and it was very sudden, and this event kind of shook me out of whatever tracks of life I had set. And I found myself back in the Bharatanatyam dance classroom, and I just couldn't stop. I couldn't do anything else. It was like it had this motor that just kept going, and um, I guess it's kept going till today. So I would say my own journey started at that point.
That's that's really beautiful, and it's interesting that there is that that catalyst for you that really, even though you were introduced to it earlier, it was kind of a later catalyst that really made you stick with it. Um, well, let's get to the topic of our conversation today, because I think you'll just be an amazing person to shed light on this. What's your just overall approach to storytelling in this current environment where audiences are so diverse and exposed to so many forms of media?
Um, so while I'm aware of media and what audiences are exposed to and who I talk to basically on a daily basis and what we're surrounded by social media and um, I think my own practice as a dancer is so heavily informed by my lived experiences, by how I learned in very close contact with my cousins, my grandmother, my sister, and later my teachers. It was a very, initially a very community based and very like communal practice of being together, dancing together, enjoying together, eating together, getting costumed together. Um, and then later, when I was in Chennai, that practice really shifted into a much more serious daily pursuit and sweat and work and labor. Um, it was always so visceral. Like, I think my experience of dance in Chennai in the heat of Chennai, and I grew up in this country, so like that was a lot to get used to, just how hot it was. We danced on cement, and it was always, you know, between 35 to 40 degrees Celsius. Um, it was during a drought in Chennai. The whole time I lived there was a drought period, so there was very little even groundwater to drink. And it was like everything um, came back to the body and came back to the foot hitting the ground, the sound of wood on, um, wood on wood. So I feel like my own approach as a dancer to storytelling really focuses on the feeling and where the feeling and energy comes from. With Chandrasekhar Sir, that there was a very deep experience of breath. Um, and like the first time I learned from him, he he demonstrated something that he did with his body, and it invited students to come and just like touch right there to see where that movement came from. And I remember that experience. It really completely changed my understanding of where does a feeling come from. So I feel like for the short answer to this is that I'm a very body-based practitioner. That is the starting point for narrative, regardless of the media.
Interesting. And so you would say, right, the narrative, despite if, even the storytelling aspect, not just the physical aspect, comes from the breath for you.
Well, I think that's a starting point. Um, and it depends what we're talking about also. Like my own choreography is usually in response to my life, as we know it, as I know it, as in it's now and not 50 or 100 years ago. Um, so, but how I sort of construct narrative has to do perhaps with the deeper feelings of what comes within me that marry with things like myth and story and music, um, and sort of it layers. So it's usually my choreography brings together um, something large, whether it be a text or like the Buddhist story of Kisa Gotami, who goes from door to door um, because her child dies and she doesn't know how to cope with grief. So she goes door to door and asks for a mustard seed from every house. that has never experienced death, which is what the Buddha tells her to do. So this is a story someone told me. It's like this old Buddhist tale. Um, and when I first started choreographing, that's the first thing I choreographed. And it came from the fact that I think so much of my practice of Bharatanatyam started with a grief, with an experience of grief. And so when I started choreographing, that was the first thing that came out. But it came out through this much more timeless tale. Um, and then the way I told the story was using the tools I had with me, my body, my breath, the tools I had from Bharatanatyam. The music was composed by Ilari Kaila, a Finnish composer who does Western classical music. And so he integrated some aspects of raga, but also um, piano and mridangam. And then the story itself was narrated by me in English. So it's sort of, there were many layers, but they're, to my mind at least, a very contemporary layer and also a very ancient layer. And then this like sort of happenstance layer, like who do I know? Who can compose the music?
So that's interesting that you say that because from a storytelling aspect, then you had the layer, a couple of layers that might have appealed to a modern audience, right? Which is the English narration as well as the more Western music. Do you think that those actually helped convey essences of the story, you know, to sort of audiences of today, or are there other tactics that might have been more powerful than ones as straightforward as those? So that was your first piece. That was the first piece that you choreographed, what, nearly like 30 years ago, or 20 to 30 years ago, let's say.
That was in 2006. So, um,
Did
yeah,
you?
I think that when it comes to dealing with forms that are not familiar to a Western audience, there are layers of interpretation that you need you have to somehow, as a practitioner, interpret or present in a way that opens the door to people who don't understand what you're doing. That said, this has so much to do with our context. For instance, anyone in New York City might go into MoMA and see plenty of modern or postmodern artwork which is incomprehensible or which is not explained to the viewer. But people accept that. They don't necessarily have an interpretation or an explanation to that work, but they accept it because it's considered high Western art. Whereas when we're practicing something which comes from in a different place, and it gets it's sort of an aspect of bias or racism that people don't have the patience to do the work of understanding what's going on in here. What is this gestural stuff? And I've experienced this in trying to perform in different audiences. If I give an explanation in English, it just opens a door. And if I don't, it makes people feel shut out and frustrated and angry. And in Q&As, I've experienced that anger. And it's always taken me by a surprise, a little like, oh, you know, and my own feeling is if you go to a performance, surely you should have the patience to sit through it and just let it seep in, just like I do when I go to a performance of art form I'm not familiar with, but I'm there because I want to be there. And I'm there because I want to experience it. But I feel like that doesn't always work. And so I think the tool I've used a lot when I'm presenting, for instance, classical work is it's kind of like I'm using language to defeat the barrier of language. When people hear a song in Tamil, Telugu, Sanskrit, Hindi, Braj, and they can't understand what's going on, they feel shut out. Now, if you think about it, this is true. This is true anywhere. I mean, in India, we don't not everyone on the street speaks all of those languages, but they can go in and watch a performance and not be frustrated by not understanding every word. Does that make sense? Whereas here, that lack of understanding the language makes people feel shut out, I feel. So I think the tactic I've used, and this is a little bit of an aside to the question you asked, but when I present classical work, which I do, which I love, when I present a Varnam in Telugu or in Tamil, I will give an English explanation, which is really, it's not extensive. It's really just like sort of answering the who, the what, the why, and like what is the primary emotion and character here. And it's really my way of just removing some of the barriers to understanding and just allowing an audience that is diverse and whom I don't know into a kind of my own little magic circle of art. Like, here, come inside. This is what's happening. You don't need to feel afraid. You don't need to feel shut out. Um, I'm welcoming you in. So that's what I feel a warm and inviting approach to say to instead of a condescending or explanatory approach, which I don't think you need to say very much when it comes to introductions. I do think you have to open the door.
And I wonder if by giving that type of introduction that you're saying, does that allow you for more range in your storytelling? Are you able to then use more subtle storytelling and feel comfortable doing that, as well as, perhaps something a little stronger and more direct? And is that something you feel, or do you still feel like audiences here in America, even if you give sort of the who, what, where, when, why up front, which obviously Indian audiences in India just kind of know from being around everything. Do you feel that no, still, your narrative and your movements have to be a lot more direct? Is it enough?
No, I mean, well, I'll answer this in a couple ways. When I present my own choreography, or whether I present, let's say if I'm looking at classical work, a varnam, a padam, um, I love performing that work. I mean, I love doing it with musicians with me. I love doing it um, in every kind of audience. So I don't feel, and the way I practice abhinaya, the way I learned from Chandrasekhar Sir, from um, Meena Raman, was a very internally generated, very subtle actually, and with a lot of nuance and a lot of play. Um, it's not in your face, and I when I do classical Bharatanatyam, it's sort of in some ways, as the Natya Shastra describes, I wear one costume. There's no costume changes. There's no props. There's no assistants on stage. There's no one playing the beloved. There's no Saki in person. It's all me. Because that's what the traditional art form, that's what the classical solo dancer does in a Varnam. You represent the Nayika, you also represent the Saki, and you also represent the beloved. So you're always playing between characters, and that is part of the art. That is the art, I think, of Abhinaya. And I think that is like, again, yeah, I think that a few words of introduction usually just opens the door and sheds, because I feel like today audiences also are sometimes sitting down, even in New York City, where people love to see dance, I think sometimes they're sitting down after like a long day, a long subway commute. They're easily angered, they're tired, whatever it is, that's all over the world. There's always hindrances to an audience member being able to enter into a performance. And I think somewhere as a performer, and some performers may totally disagree with this, but I feel my job is somewhere to say, calm down, relax, and watch and absorb. So that's my way of doing it. Now, when I'm doing something a little bit different, like my own choreography, group choreography, or like a more recent choreography was Ask Hafiz, which is a collaboration with Sahad Muradi. She tells the story of her family's journey as refugees from Afghanistan to the US. And then she asks questions to the book of Hafiz, and Hafiz, 14th century Persian poetry, gives the answer, and then I dance the answers, and we commissioned the music. So that also interplayed between an English text written by Sahad, who's a poet, and by a Persian, um, or Farsi or Dari, whatever you want to call it. It's usually called Persian at that time, sung music. So um, I kind of lost my plot somewhere, but there was the contemporary journey of Sahad's family, which happened in the 70s and 80s, and then this ancient poetry juxtaposed.
Mm.
For me, this is what I do as a classical artist. This is exactly what I do. I have one foot here and one foot here. And somehow I have to bridge them together to invite people in to that world where you're both ancient and modern at the same time.
Right, right. So you're actually doing that through these different pieces that are in your work. Speaking of, stories, do you find that nowadays and, throughout the last 20 years, do you find that some types of stories are resonating more with audiences than others and, allow for perhaps more audience excitement or engagement? Um, how have you dealt with some of that and what have you noticed?
So I would say of all of the projects I've done, I think probably Ask Hafiz has generated the most kind of excitement in terms of ideas because the language is very explicitly contemporary and the language of Sahad's poetry. And all of what we built was based on interviews. And I'm very interested in interview-based work, work based on true story. Um, it's also very specific, a very specific time, Afghanistan under Soviet rule, and it's like a refugee story. Um, and the music was also interesting, like composed by Hala Liza, who she's also translated Rumi poetry, and she's a singer, and she sings. So she knows Farsi, and she understands this language and the roots and the ancient, like where all that comes together. So I feel like those hit kind of a lot of marks. I think today's audience, um, like anything that can be like that have a political tint can go easier down or can be easier for audiences to take in and tussle with and talk about. And it's, I think, the other work I present, it's not that it's hard, but people have a hard time saying anything other than it's beautiful. It's beautiful. Like that's what they always say about classical dance, right? It's so beautiful. Like yeah, it's beautiful, but like that's not really the only point. But I think when something has um, political content, it makes it easier for people to talk about.
And is that just because they can relate it? Is it that just that they can relate it to something that's happening today, that they are a part of from a political climate perspective? Or is it just, no, they just need something to discuss after, and there's just more to discuss in something like this than, some story from the Ramayana?
I don't know. I would argue that point, but I think they're both true. So I'm going to respond to you by telling a little story from my learning period. Um, Because in some ways, I think what classical dancers are asking of audiences is sometimes a tall order. In part, well, I realized when I was in Chennai and learning that some things were very hard for me to do. Like I really felt like even though I was learning dance all day long and music and Kalaripayattu and this, that, I was doing it all, but I was not able for instance, hear a piece of music without interpreting it through English language or through language. I have a liberal arts education. Um, probably like many of you, I interpreted the world. I was trained to do that through words, through the English language. And I felt strongly that as a dancer, if I really wanted to dance, if I really wanted to have an unmediated experience of music and rhythm in my body, it could not be mediated through words. So I'm addicted to reading. I read every day. Like it's my thing. I love books. But for a period, and I can't remember how long this period lasted, I forced myself to stop reading. Um, and it was a weird experience. But at, I can say that it worked because once I sort of removed that element from my life, this was in a training phase, I was much more able to delve into what I was actually learning, which was dance. Sometimes I feel like what I'm asking audiences to do is be so present to dance and music, is be present, to be able to immerse in dance and music. Yet we all have this barrier of language constantly in our heads and in our faces all the time, and it makes it very hard to immerse. So that's one of the reasons I think it's important that language is part of a performance or presentation in some way, because that is what our brains are always doing. But if the language is there, it should also be there to remove that barrier, to allow people to enter into that other realm. Because I think if they don't get to the other realm, if they don't get to the dance, then that experience, that opportunity is lost.
Right. And I wonder, now that you're saying that, if language is such the barrier, have you ever felt that sort of solely depending on instrumental aspects versus any explanation, that might focus the audience more? Or have you felt like, no, they still need some thread of guidance through language? Like, does the lack of any language completely just create sort of a universal language?
I think I have experienced that and felt it very possible in music only performances. But if you think about Bharatanatyam, Abhinaya, how it works, even traditionally it's connected to language. Everything we do, Indendu, Vachi, Devi, everything is connected to a word. It's very hard to remove the word completely, but I do think like done a lot of collaborations with Samarth Nagarkar, who's a Hindustani vocalist, sublime music. And Hindustani music, I feel like there's much fewer words generally, and they get repeated much more and drawn out and sort of played with, that there's a lot of things that happen that is like it might be one line of poetry that gets drawn out for 20 minutes. Um, to me, that has been a very sweet spot of experimentation because you have a word, and so there's very little to explain. And then within that, you can kind of really play with emotion and gesture and meaning and movement. So I feel like maybe the answer is it depends a little on the music.
Right. You were talking about political themes being something that audiences can connect to right now. Um, are there any other themes that allow us to go back in time to older mythology? I know, a lot of the dancers that are here, um, they like the traditional stories. They want to, explore and share that mythology that they grew up with or that is so well known in the Indian pantheon. Um, do you find that there are certain themes that just audiences can connect to more than others in the kind of the older stories that we're all exposed to?
Oh, heck yeah. I mean, Shringara rules the roost in terms of, well, for traditional Bharatanatyam practitioners, your experience um, of like what the mother of all rasas is Shringara, or the romantic or erotic emotion. I'm teaching a Shringara Padam in my class now, and I can see the animation amongst my students because so much of what we're talking about is just relationships. It's really it. Yes, there is a mythological figure involved, in this case, Vishnu, um, as Krishna. But I think the beauty of Padams and Varnams, uh, largely, myths are part of those pieces. Like mythological figures feature regularly in any Padam, in any Varnam, right? But the thing with dance, and maybe other art forms, surely, but it levels the playing field between the human and the divine. So you, as a human Nayika, are talking to a divine figure, but there is no real difference between you. And in fact, you're operating in a world when gods and humans inhabit it equally. So the conversation can be very free, very open. There's no higher or lower, or um, the use of a myth, I think, or the way I understand it, maybe this is it seems a bit crass or it's practical. I don't know what it is, but the way I perceive mythological figures is that everyone knows who they are. And so you don't have to break your back trying to explain who is this character. If someone's come to your door, he's 2 hours late for the appointment, and you're mad at him because he's been probably with another woman, everyone knows you're talking about Krishna
Sure.
because this is a character we've grown up with. We know who he is. You don't, it's like saying, Frodo. Frodo. Do you know a guy like Frodo? He just likes to stay at home all the time. He doesn't like to go out and have adventures. I don't have to explain everything about Frodo for you to know what that is. And I think the beauty of myth is that, and in Bharatanatyam, is that we can play. Like, we don't have to break our heads to just play with these characters. We can bring them to life. We can dance about Ganapati and explain that he's big and loves Modaka and wants to bless everyone and bring his auspicious energy without everyone wondering, what the hell are you talking about? Like, we
Well,
know who this is.
I love that you're saying that because it makes me wonder though, have you found that the modern audience doesn't really know what you're talking about, right? Like everyone, like you and I, and everyone here on this call, they all know. But are you finding that in presenting those, even with those gods, even within the Indian diaspora, are you finding that the connection is less and less there? Are people less and less exposed?
I don't feel that. I've never really felt that. I don't know if it's because I'm spoiled living in New York City and because I'm always performing for a very, very diverse and cosmopolitan environment. But even when I was performing in Switzerland or performing, um, I mean, wherever I've gone, Bharatanatyam attracts a certain kind of rasika or audience that's also seeking. And if someone happens upon it, they might be interested. But I think I haven't recently met anyone who doesn't know who Ganesha is. Like,
Very nice to hear. And how about from a teaching perspective? Like, are you finding that over, the last 2 decades that the way you are teaching narrative has changed because of the awareness or the access of the audience, and perhaps that's the audience themselves, perhaps it's who is interested in Bharatanatyam are not the exact same people that were interested in it before. What's changed, if anything,
in
from
teaching,
yeah. Do you feel that, I think, Megha and I were talking about this before, that sometimes, she actually has to go take the Amar Chitra Katha out of, and, tell the kid to read it because they don't know a very basic story.
maybe I think let me just say, because I grew up in this country, and because so much of what I learned from my grandmother, Chandrasekhar Sir Meenaka, was always translated for me. I speak Tamil, but not like 18th century Tamil. Like, I don't speak Telugu, Sanskrit. These things all had to be translated to me and explained in some way. And I was always, like, I had to do homework. So I kind of assume in a way that everyone has to do that and that I have to do some translation work of my own so that my students can understand. Now I actually find they're helping me. I have a student in class who speaks Telugu, so she'll correct, because I don't speak Telugu, she'll correct me when I say something that's not quite right. And so I think maybe what's changed most, I can't say that my audiences have or my students have radically changed in that way over the last 20 years. I can say I have changed as an educator. Um, and I also teach in a lot of environments where people are not Indian. Like at Princeton, in the dance class, it's like, there might be one Indian in the class. Sometimes you might have studied some Bharatha Natyam, but like I don't maybe I enter a room without the expectation that everyone knows everything, but that we're all there to learn, including myself. And so we're going to build it from there. So I don't necessarily, I think there's so much information, in fact, available to people, to children, to adults now. Um, it takes a few clicks to find out more. And parents are very invested in wanting their children to learn and in following up. So I don't necessarily feel like there's been a
Shift.
no, not in that way. I think people who seek, they're still seeking.
Sure, the ones who come to you, no. And the audiences that come are ones that are either well versed in many art forms or have been exposed over time, and so there's not like a lack of a severe lack of knowledge. Um, you know, we found that there's more and more abstract themes being presented by artists. Do you think that this is in reaction to what we may perceive a modern audience wants? um, because of some of those barriers that you're talking about. Um, what's your relationship with sort of abstract themes, and how do you kind of view it from a storytelling perspective? What you might have to do?
What's an abstract theme? Or just give me an example.
So for example, you might just take the concept of fire, right? And you know, sort of let that play itself in many different ways. You might take climate change, but you're not actually telling a story, you're describing and you're painting a picture.
Yeah,
Um, perhaps the word for that is not abstract, but that's how I view it.
but like not mythologically based, not narrative based. And
Narrative based, yeah. Are people choosing to go that way because then there isn't this aspect of story that an audience has to follow? It's more just whatever they get, they get.
maybe. I think I'll answer this question in two ways. One is that Chandrasekhar Sir, in the heyday of his choreographic career, started choreographing like all abstract stuff. One of his favorite works was Krida, all based on children's games. So the whole choreography of an evening length performance was all about children's games and creating dance out of those games. Chitra Chandrasekhar, his daughter, recently did Roots, all about the roots of trees, and it obviously has like ecological underpinnings. I think for both of them, somewhere that fascination came from Sir had a very pure aesthetic minimalism, and he loved exploring movement in these different ways, and he just loved exploring through movement, abstract movement. I think today, yes, in some part, maybe that could be easier for a general audience. You don't have to explain every character in detail. I think that could provide also opportunities for more dancers to be on the stage. And also, I mean, lest we forget funding, like sometimes funders are looking for things which are not culturally specific. And if you're applying for grants in this country, you probably are trying to find topics which can appeal to um, whatever level of funding you're looking for. And I'm not saying that. I think whatever is done from an artist's, inner being. Like I said, Chandrasekhar Sir, like this, that came from him. I believe that that came from him because he never got funded for any of his works. But um, I think in this cultural context, that plays a role. So audience and funding, but also we live in a really weird time. Obviously, everything that's been happening in this country lately. I mean, I don't know. It's very hard to think about anything else. Um, so getting back a little bit to the sort of political topics in dance or environmental, I think for a lot of people right now, it's very hard to think what's the value of all of this, art and stuff when our world is burning down or there's a sense of chaos everywhere. Um, so I think sometimes people really feel the need to address this pressing need of the hour to answer it through dance,
Right.
literally. And I do too. It's just that my answer is not explicitly political.
Sure. That's really interesting that you say that. That because of the political climate, because of so much that's happening, because of opportunities that you may be presented with, there is a sense of urgency that usually it does not get associated with the arts, right? But you can create that sense of urgency by focusing on certain topics and perhaps get more people into your circle by saying, no, this is an urgent way to communicate um, this particular issue that perhaps writing or speaking would not do, um, and could create change. And so, that's interesting because that probably informs a lot of yours and other artists, choice in narrative and choreography. Um, how do you see just other aspects of storytelling evolving over time, like in the next decade? Especially with like maybe separately within the diaspora, separately, sort of outside of the diaspora.
Well, I feel the pandemic um, kind of isolated us into these boxes. Here we are in our Zoom boxes again. Like, and I think emphasized our focus onto social media. Like it sort of pushed us in there as performers, as artists, as rasikas or consumers of art, whatever. Like because that was the only option. I'm saying this because I'm sort of answering your question, like I seem to do a little obliquely, which is that my own experience of the pandemic was because I don't engage heavily in social media. And I really believe in visceral experiences of art. I like to be in the room. I believe sweat and breathing has a lot to do with how you receive and how you perform. Like, to me, that's sort of, it's where it's at. Um, so this world kind of, I stopped participating in some ways because of that. As Kafiz did have a great run online and it had a lot of wonderful audience. I'm so happy because BRM put us up to that, Brooklyn Raga Massive, and they gave us the stage, the Rubin, and they gave us a global audience. I'm very grateful for those things, but it just wasn't where my heart was to continue that online presence in that way. I long for being in real space and real time with real people to continue a relationship with an audience, um, in different physical places. And so I think there's a the emerging performers of that era basically are more married to the online forum in some ways. And I feel as we maybe are now in this political era more, I hope, critical than ever of social media platforms and finding ourselves in a place where we really need to gather as people to be part of communities, to be part of real communities. that we will move towards real in-person, like meaningful performances where we're encountering each other as people and not mediated by the screen. Um, Now, what those performances entail, I don't know. I do think like classical dance is going strong. Like, I think there are a lot of brilliant practitioners and so many stories to be told and so many ways to tell them. People incorporating, you know, narratives from interviews, um, all kinds of things that enter more theatrical ways of moving or of telling stories. But I hope people will really seek out these places to build in-person communities.
From just an advice perspective to younger artists, where have you often, you started talking about it, but where have you sought out narrative? Like where have you found it? What do you do to unearth an interesting story, an interesting interview, like you were saying? Like where do you go and how do you do the research?
It depends on the story. I think that with Ask Hafiz, I heard Sahar's story in the context of a City Lore event. Um, and I asked her to tell me her story. I interviewed her. I did a series of interviews with her and I took notes. I wrote them down. It was sometimes extremely painful for her because it dealt with loss, leaving a country, losing a family member. You know, it was not necessarily a comfortable process for her to go through those things. But she agreed, and we collaborated on building this narrative together. Um, so I think I'm really interested in collaboration, like deep collaboration with people who are really in it with me and who really want to build something together. Um, Nowadays, I work less as a company, whatever, choreographer or as a group dancer. I work most more as a solo dancer. Um, and then I feel more than ever the need to collaborate with people um, because like I'm interested in interdisciplinary work, working with a poet, working with musicians, working with lighting, working with photographers. Like I'm interested in the conversation. So I think um, because I'm interested in connecting with people, like that's where I guess when I find a story that I want to tell, like with the Kisagotami story, anyone who knew the story, I would ask them to tell it to me. Because a story is just like a translation. Everyone has a different version. Like everyone has a different version. So you're never getting a definitive story when you're coming like with mythology or a translation. Like with the Gita Govinda, there's going to be, you know, dozens of translations of each Ashtapadi, and you kind of have to go through them to be able to find your own telling. Because no matter what, like you have to find your own in to the material which is true to you.
Sure. Um, that's really interesting. And so it sounds like, what you're saying as far as like the future of storytelling goes, it is less and less sort of singular in terms of just kind of getting up there and, you know, doing the mudras and abhinaya to, get across a story. It is a very collaborative effort, perhaps a cross-disciplinary effort, where you're maybe taking elements of theater and enhancing your storytelling, and technology has enabled all these things to come together a little bit easier, it seems. But would you say that that's sort of what you're saying? It seems like there's a lot of cross-disciplinary, collaborative, sort of commingling, not necessarily fusion. You're still in the Bharatha Natyam like, framework, um, but perhaps more complex in kind of how the storytelling is happening in order to make it more simple for the audience to access almost.
Well, I think that it's, I don't, I guess I can respond to that only saying that I'm not thinking of the audience first. But in the case of Ask Hafiz, I'm thinking of my storyteller first. Whose story is it? And how do I honor that story? in a most true way possible. And maybe that would have been taken a left turn that didn't make it very friendly for the audience, but then I would have to follow that. I think the nature of collaboration or working also with stories that are deeply felt or deeply is that you kind of have to follow your story and you have to honor it, or you also have to honor your collaborators. If your collaborator says, no, I don't think this is the right way to do it, you kind of have to. Um, Interestingly, I think that's what we all have to do, whether we're doing contemporary work or traditional work. There are nothing, we cannot take anything for granted. Like, even to find people to collaborate with is a struggle in this society where we're all in silos and we're all too busy to meet. You have to really make an effort to do that. It's just that particular effort to me seems to be more than valuable. It's sort of the source of where things like can get their heat and generate power.
That's yeah, that's really well put. Um, we have just a couple of minutes. We do have a question. Madhu, I feel like Malini has answered this in a few different ways, but I'd love if you have anything else to add to this, Malini. She's curious about your journey into choreography. What was it like to transition from telling others' stories to creating your own? How did you make decisions about what stories you wanted to tell?
Well, thank you for asking that. Um, well, I started choreographing kind of like I had been in Chennai for about 4 years learning, and I was practicing a lot on my own. I had moved back to the US, and it was a little out of boredom, I feel. Like I was like, I don't, I just wanted, I want something different. And um, I want to not be bored and I want to not be alone because I was practicing a lot on my own. And in India, I was often practicing with other students or with my guru or with someone. And in the States, I wasn't. So, um, in that way, it came very naturally to like just that urge to tell a story. And then it happened to be this story of Kisagotami, which I had heard about years before, and which kind of really resonated with me when as as what it means to grieve and also seek connection with other people through like what seems to be a loss could also be a gain. Um, so the process, I don't know. I'm trying to remember what it felt like. I think it just felt very natural, like kind of like I had this steam blowing behind me and I felt very empowered to create this new story because I felt like it's so much of it came from within.
Right.
It was very exciting, like to to not wear a Bharatanatyam costume. Like I wore a kurta, which I loved the cut. It was so simple. I loved I loved that I could just pare everything down and keep only the elements that I really loved. Um, that part was especially because I mean, I know I'm a Bharatanatyam dancer, but I didn't grow up like loving all that jewelry and makeup. Like that really, I never was like a makeup or I was never a girly girl. So all of that felt quite foreign to me when I started having to wear it. So I really enjoyed the process of shedding some of it. And when I do choreography and a lot of times the costume pares down a little. It just gets a little less all over the top. And I loved collaborating with the musicians. They were so brilliant and just hearing what they came up with. And even, oh, the most exciting part was saying, like, I don't really like this. I could never say that in a traditional context when someone says, oh, Kamas Ragam, so beautiful. You can't really say, no, it's not. But in this case, it was modern contemporary music, and some of it sounded really dissonant. And it took me a while to get like even used to hearing it. But then it was a story of death. So dissonance made sense.
Mm.
I liked even having this ability to say like, oh, that's kind of weird.
Um, I don't think there are any other questions. Malini, you've touched on so many points here. I think I know had I still been practicing Bharatanatyam today in terms of, being a choreographer or in any respect, I know that this would have given me so much food for thought, and so I hope everyone else um, is feeling the same. This has been fantastic. Thank you for sharing so transparently and openly. Part of what we're trying to do at Arts India US is just have more intergenerational communication and openness um, and trying to create a community around sharing. Um, and so thank you for participating in that, and thank you all for joining in this. We will be posting the video and the summary notes for everyone to see. So please feel free to check your email. You'll probably notice it in your inbox in the next couple of days. And please make sure to follow us on Instagram. It's Arts India US, as well as visit our website. Like Mega posted, you can subscribe to our newsletter, which right now comes out about once in 2 months, but also you'll then be able to get our emails for events like this more directly. So, and spread the word. We're trying to create a larger and larger community to sort of all help each other thrive. But thank you so much, Melanie, and thank you all for coming.
Having me, thank you so much. You guys have been great, and I'm really excited about India US. It's a really, it is an endeavor badly needed here.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Bye.